Imagine the place where the lights of civilization first lit in human history. The place where cities were born, where people learned to write, count, build, and dream of the stars. This is not a fairy tale, but a reality hidden in the sands of time. We travel to ancient Mesopotamia, a land that gave the world so much, but whose name is not known to everyone today. Why is it worth looking to the history of the Sumerians? You might be surprised to learn how much of what we take for granted has its roots in this ancient culture. From the very idea of a state to the foundations of our calendar, much was born there, between two great rivers. This land, often called the cradle of civilization, holds the keys to understanding how we became who we are.
I invite you on a journey where we will awaken this ancient land together, exploring its mysteries and discoveries. We will speak not of wars and conquests, but of creation, of humanity's first steps toward progress. This will be a tranquil immersion into the past, where each discovery will unfold smoothly, like the pages of an ancient book, bestowing a sense of peace and profound understanding. So, let's begin our journey to Mesopotamia, a land where time seems to have stood still to tell us its story. Imagine a land where two great rivers, like living arteries, wound their way through fertile valleys. This is Mesopotamia, literally the land between the rivers, stretching between the Tigris and Euphrates. It was here, in this fertile crescent, that one of the earliest and most influential civilizations arose, the Sumerians. The Tigris and Euphrates were more than just rivers. They were a source of life, nourishing the land, making it fertile and capable of supporting a growing population. But along with their gifts, the rivers also brought challenges. Annual floods, while enriching the soil with silt, could be devastating, threatening crops and settlements. Water management, the construction of canals, dams, and irrigation systems became a primary concern for the land's first inhabitants. This required collective effort and organization, and as a result, contributed to the formation of more complex social structures. The Mesopotamian climate was hot and arid, making irrigation vital. Without artificial irrigation, farming would have been virtually impossible. The Sumerians pioneered this technique. They developed complex canal systems that diverted water from rivers to fields, enabling the cultivation of grains such as barley and wheat, as well as dates, vegetables, and fruits. These advances in irrigation not only ensured food security, but also facilitated population growth and the creation of a surplus that could be used for trade and the development of crafts. Settlements in Mesopotamia gradually transformed from small agricultural communities into larger, more complex urban centers. This transition, which began around the 4th millennium BCE, around 4000 BCE, marked the beginning of a new era. The first cities emerged, becoming centers of political, economic, and religious life. Among these early urban centers, Uruk, and Eridu stand out. Located on the banks of the Euphrates, was one of the oldest cities, with a history stretching back to ancient times. Uruk, also known as the biblical Erech, became one of the largest and most influential cities of its time, especially during its heyday. Eridu, located in the south, was considered one of the first cities, the place where, according to myths, the gods established kingship. These cities were not simply clusters of houses, but developing organisms with their own infrastructure, temples, markets, and government. In these cities, people began to live in more concentrated communities, which contributed to the development of labor specialization. Craftsmen emerged: potters, weavers, blacksmiths, and builders. Agriculture remained the foundation of the economy, but it was now supplemented by a variety of crafts that met the growing needs of the urban population. Life in these early cities, though more complex than in small villages, also required some organization and rules. People learned to live side by side, solve common problems, and work together for the common good. This was the slow but steady process of forming what we today call civilization. Thus, Mesopotamia's geography, rivers, climate, and landscape played a key role in shaping the Sumerian world. They provided the foundation for the development of agriculture, spurred ingenuity in irrigation and water management, and facilitated the emergence of the first cities and the development of complex social structures. It was a land where nature and human labor interacted closely, laying the foundation for great achievements yet to be discovered. It was in these fertile valleys between two mighty rivers that the slow but steady process of birthing a new era began. We are talking about the period from approximately 4000 to 3500 BCE, when small agricultural communities scattered along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates began to transform. This was a time when people who had already mastered agriculture and livestock breeding began to gather together, forming the first stable settlements. These settlements gradually grew, transforming into true urban centers, which would later become known as the cradles of Sumerian civilization. Among these early cities, Uruk, and Eridu occupy a special place. Each played a unique role in the development of Sumerian society. Eridu, located in the south, was considered one of the most ancient settlements, the place that, according to myths, the gods chose to establish kingship. This suggests that even then, thousands of years ago, people were considering the structure of governance and the legitimacy of power. Uruk, another great city, later became the center of a powerful kingdom and a place associated with the legendary hero Gilgamesh. Ur was known for its thriving port and bustling trade. These cities were not mere clusters of houses, but complex, evolving organisms. They had their own infrastructure, temples, which served not only as places of worship, but also as centers of social life and the economy, markets where goods were exchanged, and, of course, administrative systems. People began to live in more concentrated communities, which inevitably contributed to the development of labor specialization. The first artisans appeared. Potters, who created clay vessels necessary for storing food and water. Weavers, who made clothing from wool and linen. Blacksmiths, who worked metals to create tools and weapons. And builders, who erected houses, temples, and city walls. Agriculture, of course, remained the foundation of the economy. The Sumerians learned to maximize the use of fertile soils, irrigating fields with a complex system of canals and diverting water from rivers. This allowed for stable harvests of grains such as barley and wheat, as well as the cultivation of dates and vegetables. But now this basic production was supplemented by a variety of crafts that met the growing needs of the urban population.
They produced not only essential goods, but also jewelry, ritual objects, and tools for construction and agriculture. Life in these early cities, although more complex and organized than in small village communities, also required new forms of interaction. People learned to live side by side, solve common problems such as maintaining irrigation systems or defending settlements, and work together for the common good. This was a slow but steady process of shaping what we today call civilization. In these first cities, the foundations of social organization were laid, the first forms of governance developed, and public institutions emerged. One can imagine daily life in such a city. Early in the morning, when the sun was just beginning to illuminate the tops of the ziggurats, the stepped temple towers, the streets were already bustling with life. Craftsmen headed to their workshops, farmers to the fields, and merchants prepared for another day of trading. Women tended to the housework, childcare, cooking, and weaving and other household crafts. Children played in the streets, while elders taught them the basics of crafts or helped with household chores. In the evening, after the workday, people gathered, shared news, and listened to stories and myths passed down from generation to generation. It's important to understand that these early cities were still far from the mega-cities of today. They were considerably more modest in size, and life was more leisurely. But it was precisely in these conditions, influenced by geography and thanks to human ingenuity, that the foundations were formed that allowed the Sumerian civilization to reach its greatest heights. These cities became centers where knowledge accumulated, new technologies developed, and unique cultural traditions were formed. They were true foundries where the future was forged. Thus, Mesopotamia's geography, rivers, climate, and landscape played a key role in shaping the Sumerian world. They provided the foundation for the development of agriculture, spurred ingenuity in irrigation and water management, and facilitated the emergence of the first cities and the development of complex social structures. It was a land where nature and human labor interacted closely, laying the foundation for great achievements yet to be discovered. This period of urban development was a critical stage, paving the way for the flourishing of Sumerian civilization, with its writing, religion, science, and art, which we will discuss below. And so we come to one of the most intriguing questions about the Sumerians. Who were they? Where did these people come from, who founded such an advanced civilization in the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates? This question still fascinates historians and archaeologists, and while there is no single, completely indisputable answer yet, we have a number of compelling pieces of evidence that help us get closer to understanding. First, let's turn to the language. Sumerian is a true linguistic phenomenon. It is completely unlike any other known language of the ancient world, nor the languages of neighboring peoples such as the Akkadians, Amorites, or Elamites. Its grammatical structure, phonetics, and vocabulary all indicate that Sumerian is most likely an isolate, meaning a language with no proven relationship to other language families.
This uniqueness has given rise to many theories. One suggests that the Sumerians arrived in Mesopotamia from somewhere far away, perhaps from the east or southeast, bringing with them their distinctive language. Another theory, on the contrary, favors the idea that the Sumerians were an autochthonous population, that is, the original inhabitants of this land, evolving over millennia.
Archaeological finds provide additional, though not always definitive clues. Beginning in the 5th millennium BC, signs of a nascent culture associated with the Sumerians appear in southern Mesopotamia. We see the development of agriculture, the appearance of the first ceramics, and then the first settlements. By the 4th millennium BC, these settlements began to develop into true cities, such as Uruk, and Eridu. In these cities, we find artifacts that are clearly distinct from those found in the surrounding regions, such as distinctive clay vessels, jewelry, and early forms of architecture. It's important to note that no obvious traces of mass migration, which could explain the emergence of an entirely new people with a foreign language, have been found in the archaeological layers. This somewhat supports the idea of a gradual development, suggesting that Sumerian culture could have formed locally, perhaps as a result of the interaction of various population groups, with one group, the speakers of the Sumerian language, gradually becoming dominant. Imagine what these early Sumerians might have looked like. We know they were farmers, herders, and artisans. Their daily lives were closely tied to the cycles of nature and their work on the land. We can assume they wore simple linen clothing grown locally. Their houses were likely built of clay bricks, which were abundantly available. Children played in the streets, while elders taught them the basics of crafts or helped with household chores. In the evening, after a day of work, people gathered together, shared news, and listened to stories and myths passed down from generation to generation. It was in these conditions, influenced by geographical features and thanks to human ingenuity, that the foundations were formed that allowed the Sumerian civilization to reach its greatest heights. These cities became centers where knowledge accumulated, new technologies developed, and unique cultural traditions were formed. They were true foundries where the future was forged. Thus, the question of the Sumerians' origins remains open, but linguistic and archaeological evidence allows us to make informed guesses. Whether they were aliens or indigenous, their arrival and development in Mesopotamia was one of the most significant events in human history, laying the foundation for many future civilizations. This period of urban development was a critical stage, paving the way for the flourishing of the Sumerian civilization, with its writing, religion, science, and art, which we will discuss below. In the mists of time, where the fertile lands of Mesopotamia were washed by the waters of two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, one of the first great civilizations arose, the Sumerian. We continue our journey through this remarkable era, delving into the spiritual world of the Sumerians, their understanding of the universe, and the role religion played in their lives. For the Sumerians, the world was filled with a divine presence. They believed in a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses, each responsible for specific aspects of nature and human life.
These deities were not distant and abstract entities. On the contrary, they were active participants in the world, influencing harvests, weather, health, and even the outcome of wars. The Sumerians sought to maintain the gods' favor through prayers, sacrifices, and, of course, the construction of magnificent temples. Central to Sumerian mythology were ideas about the creation of the world. According to their beliefs, initially only the primordial ocean existed. From its depths emerged the first gods, who then created heaven and earth, and then all living things. These stories, passed down orally and later recorded on clay tablets, helped the Sumerians understand their place in the universe and the laws that govern it. Flood myths occupied a special place in the Sumerian worldview. Like many other ancient cultures, the Sumerians had their own version of the story of a great flood that destroyed humanity due to its sins. However, their myths always included a note of hope. One righteous person, usually Ziusudra, is warned by the gods and saved to begin a new life on earth. These stories reflected not only the fear of natural disasters, but also a belief in the possibility of renewal and continuation of life. Temples in Sumerian cities were more than just places of worship. They were the true heart of urban life, combining spiritual, economic, and political functions. At the head of each temple stood a high priest or priestess, considered intermediaries between people and the gods. Temples owned extensive landholdings, warehouses, and workshops. They accepted donations from worshippers, managed reserves of grain and other products, and provided food for temple workers and artisans. Thus, the temple served as a major economic center, ensuring the functioning of the city and its inhabitants. The life of an ordinary Sumerian was closely intertwined with religious rituals. Daily prayers, participation in temple festivals, and adherence to the priest's orders were all integral parts of their existence. The Sumerians believed that the gods could send illnesses, or conversely, heal, so they turned to the temples for help in difficult times. Priests, in addition to their spiritual duties, often acted as advisors, doctors, and even judges. Each city had its own patron god. For example, in Ur, it was the moon god, Nana. In Uruk, it was the goddess of love and fertility, Inanna. And in Eridu, it was Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom. These gods were considered the founders and protectors of their cities, and their cult was particularly strong. The Sumerians believed that a city's prosperity depended directly on how well it honored its god. It's important to understand that the Sumerian religion was polytheistic, meaning they worshipped many gods. However, this didn't mean chaos. The pantheon had its own hierarchy, headed by supreme deities, such as Anu, the god of the sky, Enlil, the god of wind and air, and Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. These gods were considered the ancestors of other lesser deities. The Sumerians' views on the afterlife were quite bleak. They believed that after death, the human soul traveled to the underworld known as Kur. This was a place of eternal darkness and dust, where souls lived in oblivion, subsisting on clay and dust. This grim outlook further emphasized the importance of earthly life and the need to earn the favor of the gods here and now. Religious festivals were vibrant events in the life of Sumerian cities. They were accompanied by processions, music, dancing, and lavish sacrifices. Temple servants, dressed in festive attire, performed rituals designed to appease the gods and ensure the city's prosperity. These festivals strengthened the sense of community among residents and reminded them of their unbreakable connection with the divine world. Sumerian art and architecture were also closely linked to their religious beliefs. Monumental temples, such as the famous ziggurat in Ur, were built as steps leading to heaven, as abode for gods on earth. Temple walls were decorated with images of gods, mythological creatures, and scenes from religious ceremonies. Sculptures of deities and rulers found during excavations demonstrate the Sumerians' desire to immortalize their deities and rulers, emphasizing their connection to the divine realm. Thus, religion and mythology were not just a part of Sumerian life. They were its core. They shaped their worldview, defined social norms, and inspired creativity and construction. These ancient beliefs, captured on clay tablets, allow us to touch the spiritual culture of one of the earliest peoples, whose worldviews profoundly influenced subsequent civilizations. In the next section, we will delve into one of the Sumerians' greatest achievements, the invention of writing, which allowed us to preserve their stories, their knowledge, and their faith. In the depths of time, in the fertile lands between the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers, one of the earliest human civilizations arose, the Sumerians. We've already discussed how religion and mythology permeated every aspect of Sumerian life, how temples served as centers of power, and how art reflected their deep spiritual beliefs. Now we'll travel back to that remarkable moment when humanity took one of the most significant steps in its development, the invention of writing. Imagine a world where information was transmitted only orally. Stories, laws, and knowledge all existed in people's memories, subject to distortion and oblivion. The Sumerians, seeking to organize their lives, record their economic transactions, and preserve important information, made a breakthrough that forever changed the course of history. Sometime between 3200 and 3000 BCE, they began transforming simple drawings into a complex system of symbols. This process began with pictograms, images that directly represented objects. For example, a drawing of a bull's head meant bull, while an image of a wheat ear meant wheat. These signs were intuitive and easy to understand. However, recording more complex concepts, such as actions or abstract ideas, required a more sophisticated system. The Sumerians began using ideograms, where a single symbol could represent an entire word or even a concept. For example, an image of a foot could mean walk or stand. Gradually, for convenience and speed, these drawings became stylized. Instead of drawing images, scribes began to press symbols into soft clay using a sharpened reed. The marks left by this tool were wedge-shaped. This gave birth to cuneiform, a unique writing system that became the hallmark of Mesopotamia for millennia. Clay was an accessible and inexpensive material. Scribes prepared small tablets, shaped them, and then, using a stylus, inscribed cuneiform symbols on them. The tablets were then dried in the sun or baked in a kiln, becoming durable carriers of information. It was a true miracle. The ability to preserve words, thoughts, and events for centuries. The role of scribes in Sumerian society was extremely important. They were keepers of knowledge, administrators, and intermediaries between people and the gods. Learning to write was a long and arduous process. Young men, and sometimes women, spent years in special schools called eduba, meaning tablet house. There, they studied hundreds of signs, mastered grammar, literature, and even arithmetic. These schools were not just places of learning, but also centers of cultural life. Here, ancient texts were copied and studied, literary works were created, and laws and economic accounting were recorded. Sumerian scribes were true chroniclers of their era, creating what we today call the archive of Sumerian civilization. Thanks to their work, we know about the daily life, beliefs, history, and science of this ancient people. Imagine the daily life of a scribe. He arrives at the eduba early in the morning, sits down at a clay tablet, carefully prepares the clay, and begins writing. His fingers deftly move the stylus, tracing orderly rows of cuneiform signs. He might be recording grain contracts, issuing royal decrees, keeping records of temple property, or rewriting ancient myths. His work required incredible precision, patience, and perseverance. Writing enabled the Sumerians to develop complex forms of governance and economy. It became possible to keep detailed records of harvests, taxes, and goods moving along trade routes. This facilitated the growth of cities and the strengthening of their power. Laws recorded on clay tablets became the foundation of the legal system, ensuring justice and order. Moreover, writing opened the door to the development of science and literature. The Sumerians began recording their stellar observations, their mathematical calculations, and their medical knowledge. The first literary works were created, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, which, although completed later, is rooted in Sumerian tradition. These texts, written in cuneiform, became an invaluable source for understanding the Sumerian worldview and spiritual world. It's important to understand that cuneiform was not static. It evolved over millennia, adapting to new needs and languages. Sumerian, originally written in cuneiform, gradually fell out of use as a living language, but cuneiform continued to be used to record Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and other Mesopotamian languages. The invention of writing was more than just a technological achievement. It was a fundamental change in the way we thought and communicated. It allowed humanity to accumulate knowledge, build more complex societies, and leave behind invaluable evidence of its existence. Born out of the need to organize the world, Sumerian cuneiform became the key that opened the doors to their remarkable civilization, allowing us to hear the voices of people who lived thousands of years ago. In the next section, we will examine how the societies of these first cities were organized and who ruled them. So, we've learned about the Sumerians' greatest invention, writing, which became the foundation for preserving their knowledge and culture. Writing allowed us to glimpse their world, and now, based on these records, we can imagine how the societies of these first cities were organized, who ruled them, and how their inhabitants lived. The primary form of political organization in Sumer was the city-state. This was not a single centralized region as we understand a country today. Each city, such as Uruk, or Lagash, was an independent entity with its own ruler, laws, and army. These city-states were surrounded by fertile lands that they cultivated, and they often competed with one another for resources and influence. At the head of the city-state stood a ruler who bore the title of Lugal. This term literally means great man or king. The Lugal was not only a military commander, but also the high priest and chief judge. His power was considerable, but not absolute. He was responsible for the well-being of his city, ensuring its defense and maintaining order. In times of peace, the Lugal was responsible for developing infrastructure, building temples and canals, and organizing trade. However, the power of the Lugal was closely intertwined with that of the priests. Temples played a colossal role in the life of Sumerian society. They were not only centers of religious worship, but also economic institutions. Temples owned large tracts of land, stored grain and other products, engaged in handicrafts, and even provided loans. The priests who managed the temples wielded enormous authority and influence. They were the guardians of knowledge, practicing astronomy, medicine, and education. Lugals often came from priestly families or were closely connected to the temple hierarchy. The life of the ordinary city-state resident was closely tied to their community and the temple. Most of the population were farmers who cultivated fields belonging either to the temple, the community, or private individuals. There were also artisans, potters, weavers, blacksmiths, and jewelers who produced essential goods. There were also merchants who exchanged goods within the city and with other settlements. Despite the hierarchy, certain civil rights and obligations existed. Every free citizen had the right to protection from the state and could participate in popular assemblies, which, however, had limited influence, especially in later periods. Responsibilities included paying taxes, which primarily went toward maintaining temples and the army, as well as carrying out public works, such as building canals or repairing city walls. Social inequality also existed. At the top of the social ladder were the ruler and priests. Below them were officials, scribes, military leaders, and wealthy merchants. The bulk of the population consisted of farmers and artisans. At the very bottom were slaves, who, however, constituted a smaller portion of society than in some other ancient civilizations. Slaves were prisoners of war or people trapped in debt bondage. Everyday life in the Sumerian city was measured and governed by the rhythm of agricultural work and religious festivals. Morning began with sunrise. Men went to the fields or workshops, while women tended to the household, raised children, and prepared food. The staple diet consisted of barley bread, dates, vegetables, and fish. Meat was not available to everyone and was reserved for special occasions. Children from noble families received an education in temple schools, where they were taught cuneiform, arithmetic, and other sciences. This was important, as the ability to read and write opened the door to prestigious positions. For most children, however, their primary education was helping their parents with their craft or work. Law was an important aspect of social organization. The Sumerians developed some of the world's first law codes, which regulated various aspects of life, from family relations and marriage to trade and punishment for crimes. These laws, recorded on clay tablets, provided a certain stability and predictability in society. For example, there were laws regarding the terms of hiring workers, land lease regulations, and liability for damages. Thus, Sumerian society was complex and multifaceted. The city-state, with its ruler and priesthood, defined rights and obligations for its citizens, and developed crafts and trade, constituted a stable social and political structure. This structure, formed in the fertile valley between rivers, became the foundation for the subsequent development of civilization. And although wars between city-states were frequent, they also contributed to the spread of Sumerian culture and technology. Now that we have an idea of how society was structured, let's move on to one of the most amazing achievements of the Sumerians, their scientific and technological inventions that truly changed the course of history. So, we've seen how Sumerian society formed, how its city-states developed, and how its laws and social structure evolved. Now, let's turn our attention to what served as the foundation of this civilization, its economic support. This, of course, was agriculture, as well as crafts and trade, which nourished the life of Sumerian cities. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was incredibly fertile. The ancient Sumerians were skilled farmers. They learned to harness the waters of these great rivers to irrigate their fields, allowing them to reap bountiful harvests. This was no easy task. Complex systems of canals, dams, and reservoirs had to be built to manage the water flow, protect crops from flooding, and provide moisture during dry periods. These irrigation systems were true engineering marvels of their time. Thanks to them, the Sumerians could grow not only grains such as barley and wheat, but also dates, vegetables, and fruits. Barley was especially important, as it was used to make bread and, of course, beer, a popular beverage. The yield was so high that it not only fed the population, but also created a surplus. This surplus was essential for the development of other areas of life. It supported artisans who were not directly involved in agriculture, and also served as the basis for trade. In addition to agriculture, the Sumerians developed a variety of crafts. Their cities were home to potters making clay pottery, weavers creating clothing from wool and linen, blacksmiths working with metal, builders constructing houses and temples, and jewelers creating jewelry from precious stones and metals. Each craftsman specialized in their craft, which improved the quality of their products and allowed for the creation of more complex and varied items. We find abundant evidence of this in archaeological excavations, from simple clay pots to exquisite gold jewelry and bronze tools. Specialization of labor was one of the key characteristics of Sumerian society, It meant that people could dedicate themselves to a specific craft, honing their skills throughout their lives. This led to the emergence of true masters of their craft, whose products were valued not only within the city, but also beyond its borders. Of course, not all the necessary resources were available in Mesopotamia itself. For example, metals such as copper and tin needed to make bronze, or precious stones such as lapis lazuli had to be brought from far away. This stimulated the development of trade. The Sumerians were skilled traders. They used their goods, such as grain, textiles, pottery, and metalwork, to exchange them for raw materials and other necessary products. The Sumerians' trade routes extended over vast distances. They traded with peoples living to the east in the Persian Gulf, from where they imported copper and stone. They also established contacts with peoples living to the west, in Anatolia, where metals could be sourced. Individual expeditions even traveled to distant lands to extract valuable materials. We know of Sumerian trade links with the Indus Valley, home to the Harappan civilization, and even with Egypt. Ports on the Euphrates and the Persian Gulf played a special role in trade. Cities like were major trading centers, facilitating the flow of goods. Ships transported grain and handicrafts, and in the opposite direction, they carried wood, metals, stone, and other valuable materials. To conduct trade and record-keeping, the Sumerians needed a sophisticated system. It is here that we again see the importance of their invention, writing. Records on clay tablets helped them keep track of goods, draw up contracts, and record debts and payments. This created transparency and trust in trade transactions. Trade played a vital role in Sumerian daily life. City markets offered everything from food to household items. Merchants were respected members of society. They not only provided the population with essential goods, but also facilitated the exchange of cultural values and ideas between different peoples. Thus, agriculture, crafts, and trade were closely intertwined and formed the basis for the prosperity of the Sumerian civilization. Fertile soil, the skill of artisans, and the entrepreneurial spirit of merchants enabled the Sumerians to create a complex and advanced economic system, which, in turn, became the foundation for their subsequent achievements in science, art, and government. Now that we have a picture of how the Sumerians made a living and provided for themselves, let's move on to one of their most astonishing achievements, the scientific and technological inventions that truly changed the course of history. The Sumerians, these amazing ancient creators, not only laid the foundations of writing, cities, and statehood, but also made breakthroughs in science and technology that still serve us today. Their inventions became the solid foundation upon which subsequent civilizations grew. Let's delve into the world of Sumerian discoveries that truly changed the course of history. One of the most significant inventions, one we take for granted today, is the wheel. While we can't say with absolute certainty that the Sumerians were the first to invent it, it was in Mesopotamia that the earliest archaeological evidence of its use appears. The first wheels, which appeared around the middle of the 4th millennium BC, weren't like the wheels we imagine today. They were rather solid discs carved from wood, often consisting of several planks fastened together. These wheels were heavy and not very durable, but they were a true revolution. Imagine moving heavy loads in the past. Everything was done by hand or with sledges, requiring enormous effort and time. With the advent of the wheel, carts became possible. They were first used to transport earth during the construction of canals and temples, and later for transporting goods. This significantly eased labor and opened up new opportunities for trade and construction. The wheel became a symbol of progress, and its importance is difficult to overestimate. It allowed us to move faster, carry more, build higher, and create more complex mechanisms. Another vital invention closely linked to agriculture was the plow. Agriculture was the foundation of the Mesopotamian economy, and the Sumerians constantly sought ways to increase crop yields. Simple tools for cultivating the land had existed before, but the Sumerian plow, which appeared around the middle of the 4th millennium BC, was more sophisticated. Initially, it was made of wood and used for loosening the soil. Later, with the development of metallurgy, plows began to be equipped with metal plowshares, making them more efficient. The plow allowed for the cultivation of larger areas of land with less labor. It turned the soil, making it looser and more accessible to nutrients. This was especially important in Mesopotamia, where the soil could be quite compact. The plow made it possible to grow more grain, ensuring food security and facilitating population growth. Plowing became a routine part of life for many Sumerians. From dawn to dusk, they toiled in the fields, securing their future. But even the best plow would be ineffective without water. Mesopotamia, as we've already mentioned, was located in an arid zone, and life there depended on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. However, these rivers often flooded unpredictably, and water could be scarce during the summer months. The Sumerians, brilliant engineers, developed complex irrigation systems. They built canals, dams, and reservoirs to control river flows, divert water to fields during dry periods, and prevent devastating floods. These irrigation systems were incredibly complex for their time. They required the combined efforts of an entire city, or even several cities, to build and maintain. Water management became one of the most important functions of city government. Priests and rulers were often responsible for water distribution, which gave them considerable influence. Thanks to these systems, the Sumerians were able to transform arid land into fertile fields where they grew wheat, barley, dates, and other crops. Irrigation became key to the prosperity and growth of their civilization. Another important area of development was metalworking. The Sumerians were among the first to master metalworking, primarily copper and then bronze. Around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, they began actively using bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. This allowed them to create stronger and more durable tools, weapons, and jewelry. Metal plows, axes, knives, and swords, all of this significantly increased labor efficiency and military might. Extracting and processing metals required specialized knowledge and skills. Craftsmen emerged, blacksmiths, foundrymen, and jewelers. Working with metal was complex and dangerous, but it brought high income and respect. Sumerian artisans achieved a high level of skill in casting, chasing, and engraving.
They created elegant jewelry, figurines of gods and rulers, and household items. Metallurgy opened new horizons for the development of crafts and trade, and also contributed to the development of military affairs. But Sumerian achievements weren't limited to material inventions. They also made significant contributions to the development of science, particularly in astronomy and mathematics. Observations of celestial bodies were important to the Sumerians for several reasons. First, for agriculture. A calendar based on the cycles of the moon and sun helped determine the time for sowing and harvesting. Second, for religion. The movements of celestial bodies were often associated with the will of the gods, and astronomers served as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. The Sumerians developed a lunar calendar consisting of 12 months. They learned to predict eclipses and other astronomical phenomena. Their star observations were very accurate for their time. They named many constellations, some of which survive to this day. Astronomy was more than just a science. It was an integral part of their worldview, helping them navigate space and time and understand their place in the universe. In mathematics, the Sumerians used a sexagesimal number system based on the number 60. This system, unlike our decimal system, may seem unusual, but it had its advantages. The number 60 is divisible by many other numbers: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, making it convenient for calculations, especially in trade and astronomy. It is thanks to the Sumerians that we still use 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle. The Sumerians developed methods of multiplication and division and solved simple quadratic equations. They used fractions and knew how to calculate areas and volumes. Their mathematical knowledge was practical and applied in construction, trade, and land surveying. Scribes, who were educated people, spent much time studying mathematics to keep records, calculate taxes, and plan construction projects. This knowledge, acquired thousands of years ago, became the foundation for the development of mathematics in subsequent cultures. Thus, the Sumerians left us a vast legacy in science and technology. Their inventions, the wheel, the plow, irrigation, and metallurgy, became catalysts for the development of civilization. And their achievements in astronomy and mathematics laid the foundation for future scientific discoveries. Thus, the Sumerians left us a vast legacy in science and technology. Their inventions, the wheel, the plow, irrigation, and metallurgy, became catalysts for the development of civilization. And their achievements in astronomy and mathematics laid the foundation for future scientific discoveries. These people who lived so long ago continue to influence our lives, often imperceptibly, but indelibly. They demonstrated that the human mind is capable of overcoming any difficulties and creating amazing things that will benefit generations to come. The art and architecture of the Sumerian civilization, like their achievements in science and writing, left an indelible mark on history.
The Sumerians sought not only to reflect reality, but also to convey through their creations profound meanings associated with their beliefs and worldview. The Sumerians achieved remarkable mastery in sculpture. Their most characteristic works are human figurines, often depicted in prayerful poses. These figures, made of clay, stone, or alabaster, typically have large, expressive eyes, symbolizing their attention to the divine. Such figurines were often placed in temples, representing those praying to the gods. Male figures were typically depicted with beards and wearing long robes, while females wore headdresses and jewelry. It's important to note that these sculptures were not portraits in the modern sense, but rather generalized images intended to evoke specific emotions and associations. Note the details of the clothing, the folds of which were carefully crafted, demonstrating the artisan's skill in conveying the texture of the fabric. Another outstanding achievement of Sumerian art were cylinder seals. These small cylinders, carved from stone, bore engraved images and inscriptions on their surface. When such a cylinder was rolled on wet clay, it left an impression that served as a kind of signature or mark of ownership. The images on the seals were extremely varied. Scenes from the lives of the gods, mythological scenes, depictions of animals, as well as scenes from everyday life, such as hunting or farming. These seals not only served a practical function, but were also true works of art, demonstrating a high level of engraving skill. The small size of the seals required particular precision and attention to detail. The seal impression could be used to seal documents, vessels, or doors. Sumerian architecture also deserves special attention. The most impressive structures were temples, which served not only as religious centers, but also as focal points for the city's social and economic life. The most famous type of Sumerian temple is the ziggurat. The ziggurat was a stepped pyramid built of mud brick. At the top of the ziggurat was a small temple dedicated to the city's main deity. The ziggurat was believed to serve as a bridge between heaven and earth, a place where the gods could descend to their worshippers. The construction of such monumental structures required enormous labor resources and a well-organized workforce. An example of a grand temple complex is the temple in the city of Ur. Dedicated to the moon god Nana, this temple was one of the largest and most majestic buildings of its time. It consisted of several levels, connected by wide staircases. The temple walls were decorated with reliefs and paintings, and the interiors were richly decorated. In addition to temples, the Sumerians also built other structures, such as palaces, city walls, and residential buildings. Residential buildings were typically constructed of mud brick and had flat roofs, which were used for relaxation and work in hot weather. The aesthetics of Sumerian art were closely linked to their religious beliefs. Many images and architectural forms had symbolic meaning. For example, images of bulls were often associated with strength and fertility, while images of birds were associated with divine messengers. The colors used in paintings and decorations also had symbolic significance. For example, blue was often associated with water and the sky. It's important to understand that Sumerian art and architecture evolved over many centuries, reflecting changes in society and beliefs. From early, simple forms to more complex and monumental structures, the Sumerians continually strived for perfection, striving to express their understanding of the world and humanity's place in it. Their creations, which have survived through the millennia, allow us to touch the world of the people who laid the foundations for many aspects of our modern civilization. These works of art and architecture are not simply testaments to the past, but also a source of inspiration, reminding us of the boundless potential of human creativity. The period we call the early dynastic period begins. This time, spanning approximately 2900 to 2334 BCE, marked the heyday of the Sumerian city-states. Imagine how these ancient settlements we've already mentioned, such as Uruk, and Lagash, developed into powerful centers, each with its own ruler, its own laws, and its own unique history. During this period, Sumerian civilization reached its peak. Cities grew, their walls became stronger, and their temples more magnificent. Life was in full swing. Merchants bustled along the streets. Artisans toiled in their workshops, and farmers cultivated fields irrigated by ingenious canals. This was the time when Sumerian culture, art, and technology reached their apogee, laying the foundations for many future achievements. However, as often happens in history, periods of prosperity are not without challenges. City-states, while independent, often entered into rivalries with one another. This rivalry could manifest itself in trade disputes, territorial claims, or simply a desire for dominance. Wars, though not always on a large scale by our modern standards, were part of this era. They were fought for control of fertile lands, access to water resources, or trade routes. Despite conflicts, the Sumerian city-states also knew how to cooperate. They formed alliances, sometimes temporary, sometimes more lasting, to defend against common enemies or to undertake major joint projects, such as the construction of irrigation systems, which were vital for agriculture. Such alliances helped maintain relative stability in the region. During this period, the names of rulers who left their mark on history emerge. For example, the city of Lagash was ruled by a king named Eannatum, who, according to inscriptions found, defeated the neighboring city of Umma. His victory was celebrated as a significant event, and he became known as a great warrior and defender of his city. Another famous ruler was Enmebaragesi of Kish, who, according to some accounts, even led a campaign into the territory of the future Elam, testifying to the growing ambitions of the Sumerian rulers. People's daily lives during this period were closely linked to the cycles of nature and the social life of the city. Agriculture remained the primary occupation. Peasants cultivated the fields, growing barley, wheat, and dates. They depended on the timely flooding of rivers and the irrigation systems maintained by the entire city. Life in the city was more diverse. Craftsmen, potters, blacksmiths, weavers, and jewelers produced goods that were used both within the city and sold in markets. Trade played a significant role. The Sumerians needed materials scarce in their fertile valley, such as wood, metals, and precious stones. They exchanged their agricultural products and handicrafts for these essential resources. Trade routes extended far, linking Mesopotamia with the Persian Gulf, Anatolia, and perhaps even the Indian Valley. The social structure was quite clear. At the head of the city-state stood a ruler called a Lugal, literally meaning great man. Lugals could be either military leaders or high priests, or a combination of both. Priests still wielded considerable influence, as temples were not only centers of spiritual life, but also major landowners and economic institutions. Below them were scribes, officials, merchants, artisans, and at the very bottom, farmers and hired laborers. During this period, Sumerian art continued to develop. Cylinder seals, used to authenticate documents and objects, continued to be produced. Each seal was a unique work of art, often depicting scenes from mythology, religious rituals, or everyday life. Sculpture also reached a high level of mastery. Famous statues of rulers and deities were created, often with large, expressive eyes, symbolizing attentiveness and a connection to the divine. Architecture continued to evolve. Ziggurats, stepped temple towers, grew ever more majestic, reaching for the heavens. They served not only as places of worship, but also as a symbol of the city's power and its connection to the gods. Residential buildings were typically constructed of mud brick, and their layout reflected the needs of the family, often including an inner courtyard. It's important to understand that even amid wars and political upheavals, life went on. People bore children, raised them, celebrated holidays, believed in their gods, and strove for a better life. The period of the early dynasties was a time of formation for the Sumerian identity, a time when the foundations of their culture and civilization were laid, a time that would have a profound impact on the entire subsequent course of history. This was a period when the Sumerian city-states shone like precious stones on the map of the ancient world, each with its own unique brilliance and significance. After the heyday of the Sumerian city-states, a time when each city shone like a precious jewel on the map of the ancient world, a new turning point arrived. This period was marked by the Akkadian conquest, an event that transformed the political landscape of Mesopotamia and put an end to the independence of the Sumerian city-states. Around 1934 BCE, in the very heart of Sumer, a new power began to emerge. This power was associated with the name of Sargon, a ruler known as Sargon the Great. He hailed from Akkad, a region north of Sumer. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic language distinct from Sumerian, but they had long been under the cultural and political influence of their southern neighbors. Sargon, an ambitious and talented military leader, managed to unite the disparate Akkadian tribes and then direct his energies south. His military campaigns were successful. He conquered the Sumerian cities one after another, bringing them under his control. This process took some time, but Sargon eventually achieved his goal. He didn't simply conquer the Sumerian cities. He created something new, the first empire in Mesopotamian history. This empire encompassed the entire Mesopotamian landmass, from the Persian Gulf in the south to the northern regions. The city of Akkad became the capital of this empire. Its exact location is still a subject of research, but its importance as the center of the first great power is undeniable. Sargon the Great reigned for approximately 56 years, during which time he laid the foundations of a new state structure. He appointed governors to conquered cities, introduced a unified system of government, and standardized certain aspects of life, such as weights and measures. It's important to note that the Akkadian conquest did not simply destroy Sumerian culture. On the contrary, it led to an interesting process of mutual influence. The Akkadians, having conquered Sumer, themselves adopted much from the Sumerians. They adopted Sumerian cuneiform, adapting it to record their Semitic language. Sumerian gods were incorporated into the Akkadian pantheon, often identified with local deities. Sumerian myths and literary works continued to exist, but now they were also accessible to the Akkadian population. At the same time, Akkadian culture also influenced Sumer. The Semitic language became the language of administration and trade, gradually displacing Sumerian in some areas of public life. Akkadian sculpture and art developed, borrowing and reworking Sumerian traditions. The result was a unique cultural syncretism, where elements of two distinct civilizations intertwined. Everyday life during this period continued to have its own characteristics. Despite the shift in power, agriculture remained the foundation of the economy. Peasants continued to cultivate their fields, irrigating them with water from the Tigris and Euphrates. Craftsmen continued their work, producing ceramics, textiles, and metalwork. Merchants maintained connections between cities and regions, although trade routes were now under the control of a single empire. However, like any large state, the Akkadian Empire faced internal and external challenges. After the death of Sargon and his successors, the empire began to weaken. Rebellions occurred in conquered cities, as well as raids from neighboring peoples. By approximately 1954 BCE, the Akkadian Empire had collapsed. But even after its fall, the legacy of this period was significant. The Akkadian conquest demonstrated the possibility of creating a unified state in Mesopotamia. It demonstrated the power of centralized authority and effective governance. Furthermore, the period of Akkadian rule facilitated the spread of Sumerian culture and knowledge beyond Sumer, paving the way for the further development of civilization in the region. This was a time when the boundaries between peoples became more blurred, and ideas and achievements began to flow freely, enriching the entire ancient world. Following the collapse of the mighty Akkadian Empire, when centralized power weakened and the city-states regained relative independence, a period began that historians call the Neo-Sumerian period. This period, from approximately 1200 to 1300 BCE, was marked not just by a restoration, but by a true renaissance of Sumerian culture. It was a period when ancient traditions seemed to regain their strength, and the Sumerian language and writing reached their peak. The third dynasty of Ur occupies a special place during this period. This was a dynasty of rulers who managed to unite much of Mesopotamia under their rule, restoring it to its former glory. The founder of this dynasty is considered to be Ur-Nammu, who reigned from approximately 1200 to 1217 BCE. He was not only a conqueror, but also an outstanding administrator and legislator. It was under Ur-Nammu that one of the oldest known legal codes, the Code of Ur-Nammu, was compiled. This code, which has come down to us in fragments, testifies to the desire to establish a just order, regulate economic relations, and protect the rights of citizens. It laid the foundation for future legal systems, demonstrating the maturity of Sumerian society. Under the rule of the third dynasty of Ur, the city-states, once torn by internal strife, regained stability. Governance became more centralized, and the administrative system more efficient. Extensive construction projects were undertaken that left an indelible mark on the Mesopotamian landscape. One of the most impressive achievements of this period was the construction of grandiose temples known as ziggurats. Ziggurats were stepped towers erected in honor of major deities. The most famous of these is the Great Ziggurat at Ur, built under Ur-Nammu. It was a monumental structure built of mud brick, faced with fired brick, and adorned with majestic staircases. The ziggurat served not only as a place of worship, but also as a center of public life, a grain storage facility, and an administrative building. Its size and complexity are astonishing even by modern standards, testifying to a high level of engineering expertise and labor organization. The construction of such large-scale structures required colossal resources and a well-organized workforce.
Thousands of people labored on construction sites, quarrying clay, making bricks, and erecting walls. This labor was not only a duty, but also a part of social life, uniting people in a shared endeavor. In addition to temples, other important structures were built: palaces, city walls, and irrigation canals. The network of irrigation canals was vital for agriculture, which remained the backbone of the economy. The Sumerians were skilled engineers, able to manage the water resources of the Tigris and Euphrates, ensuring crop yields even in arid climates. Trade also boomed during this period. Despite their centralized governance, city-states maintained active trade relations with each other and with neighboring regions.
Sumerian merchants traveled to distant lands, bringing precious metals, timber, semi-precious stones, and other essential goods that could not be mined locally. In turn, they exported grain, handicrafts, and textiles. Daily life in the Neo-Sumerian period, although subject to laws and the will of rulers, retained its familiar characteristics. Peasants continued to toil the land, following centuries-old traditions. Craftsmen, from potters and weavers to jewelers and metallurgists, created their own products, which found demand in both domestic and foreign markets. The family remained the fundamental social unit, and family values and customs were carefully preserved. Priests continued to play an important role in society. They not only served the gods, but also wielded significant influence in government, preserving knowledge and educating. Scribes trained in the art of cuneiform were indispensable for record-keeping, document compilation, and the preservation of historical records. Despite the spread of Akkadian, the Sumerian language remained the language of religion, literature, and science, experiencing a kind of rebirth. The literature of this period saw the emergence of new works, while older ones were rewritten and expanded. Myths, hymns, and epic poems, all of this created the rich cultural fabric of Sumerian society. One of the most prominent literary forms were hymns dedicated to gods and rulers, glorifying their deeds and beseeching their favor.
However, like any great civilization, the Neo-Sumerian period could not last forever. Around 1300 BCE, the power of the third dynasty of began to wane. Internal problems, economic difficulties, and, most importantly, external threats led to a gradual decline. One of the key reasons for the decline was the invasion of the Amorites, Semitic tribes who gradually penetrated Mesopotamia. They were warlike and sought to seize land and resources. Gradually, Amorite leaders began to gain strength in various regions, weakening the central government. The final blow to the Neo-Sumerian Empire was dealt by the invasion of the Amorites and other eastern tribes, such as the Elamites. Around 1300 BCE, the capital of was destroyed, and the third dynasty of fell. This event marked the end of the era of Sumerian dominance in Mesopotamia. But even after the collapse of statehood, Sumerian culture did not disappear without a trace. The Amorite rulers who came to power largely adopted Sumerian traditions, language, and writing. The Sumerian language continued to be used for religious purposes and as the language of the educated elite for many centuries. Cuneiform, a Sumerian invention, became the basis for writing Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian. The Sumerian legacy, accumulated over millennia, became the foundation for the development of subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. Their achievements in law, literature, science, technology, and art had a profound impact on the entire history of humanity. From laws regulating social life to myths explaining the world, from the wheel that eased labor to writing that preserved knowledge, all of this has become an integral part of our shared cultural heritage. Thus, the Neo-Sumerian period, and particularly the reign of the third dynasty of became a shining chapter in the history of Mesopotamia. It was a time of rebirth, flourishing, and preservation of the unique Sumerian civilization. A period that, despite its decline, left an indelible mark on history, continuing to inspire and amaze us with its achievements. It was a time when the ancient stones of the ziggurats erected by the Sumerians continued to stand, a reminder of the grandeur of the past and the deep roots of our modern civilization. The third dynasty of fell. This event marked the end of the era of Sumerian dominance in Mesopotamia. But even after the collapse of statehood, Sumerian culture did not disappear without a trace. The Amorite rulers who came to power largely adopted Sumerian traditions, language, and writing. The Sumerian language continued to be used for religious purposes and as the language of the educated elite for many centuries. Cuneiform, a Sumerian invention, became the basis for writing Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian. The Sumerian legacy, accumulated over millennia, became the foundation for the development of subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. Their achievements in law, literature, science, technology, and art had a profound impact on the entire history of humanity.
From laws regulating social life to myths explaining the world, from the wheel that eased labor to writing that preserved knowledge, all of this has become an integral part of our shared cultural heritage. Thus, the Neo-Sumerian period, and particularly the reign of the third dynasty of Ur, became a shining chapter in the history of Mesopotamia. It was a time of rebirth, flourishing, and preservation of the unique Sumerian civilization. A period that, despite its decline, left an indelible mark on history, continuing to inspire and amaze us with its achievements. It was a time when the ancient stones of the ziggurats erected by the Sumerians continued to stand, a reminder of the grandeur of the past and the deep roots of our modern civilization.
The decline of Sumerian civilization was a gradual process, like the slow extinction of an ancient fire, which nevertheless left behind smoldering embers capable of reigniting the flame. The causes of this decline were multifaceted and intertwined, like threads in a complex pattern. One of the key factors was the depletion of internal resources. Millennia of intensive agriculture, particularly with the help of irrigation systems, led to the salinization of soils in southern Mesopotamia. This reduced crop yields, which in turn weakened the economic power of the city-states. Farmers, faced with declining productivity, may have begun to abandon their lands, seeking more fertile areas. Another important factor in the decline was external factors, particularly migrations and invasions. Around the beginning of the second millennium BCE, new peoples began to penetrate Mesopotamia, among them the Amorites. These tribes, initially nomadic, gradually began to settle on the outskirts of Sumerian territories and then in the cities themselves. Their invasions, although not always immediately devastating, undermined the stability and autonomy of the Sumerian states. The struggle for resources and territorial control became increasingly intense. Amorite invasions did not always mean complete annihilation. Often it was a process of gradual assimilation. The Amorites, less advanced in some aspects of civilization, admired the achievements of the Sumerians and Akkadians. They adopted their language, writing, religious beliefs, and administrative practices. Thus, cities captured by the Amorites did not always fall into ruins. Rather, a fusion of cultures occurred, with the new rulers becoming the guardians and continuers of ancient traditions. Among the key figures of this period are rulers who attempted to preserve the remnants of Sumerian power, or successfully integrated into the new order. However, unlike the earlier dynasties, when rulers such as Gilgamesh became legendary heroes, the names of the last Sumerian kings, whose power had already weakened, are less vividly remembered. It's important to understand that this decline was not a single event. It was a long process, spanning centuries, as Sumerian political power gradually waned, giving way to new powers. Daily life during this transitional period likely changed gradually. For a simple farmer living far from political centers, a change in rulers may not have meant radical changes in their way of life. However, economic difficulties associated with soil depletion and the possibility of military action undoubtedly impacted their well-being. People may have begun to rely less on harvests and more on alternative sources of income, such as crafts or trade.
Changes in power often led to the redistribution of land and resources. Amorite rulers, becoming masters of cities, could favor their supporters, which could cause discontent among the indigenous population. However, in most cases, the new nobility sought to preserve the existing social and economic structure to ensure stability and income. The Sumerian language, as mentioned, continued to survive. It remained the language of the temples, where priests performed rituals and preserved sacred texts. It was also used in educational institutions, where young scribes studied ancient literary works and legal documents. Sumerian literature, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, continued to be read and copied, preserving its cultural value. An important aspect to note is that the Amorite invasion did not lead to the complete oblivion of Sumerian civilization. On the contrary, it facilitated its expansion. The Amorites, adopting Sumerian achievements, carried them with them to new territories, facilitating cultural exchange. Thus, the Sumerian heritage became part of the broader Mesopotamian civilization. The Sumerians' legacy to subsequent civilizations is immense. They laid the foundations for many aspects of human life that we take for granted. Their invention of writing, cuneiform, became the cornerstone of literacy and the transmission of knowledge. Without this invention, human history would have been completely different. In the legal realm, Sumerian laws, such as the famous Code of Ur-Nammu, established principles of justice and order that influenced subsequent legal systems. These laws regulated various aspects of life, from family relations to trade transactions, and served as a model for many subsequent legislators. The scientific and technological achievements of the Sumerians also left an indelible mark. The invention of the wheel, the plow, and the development of irrigation systems, all of these radically changed agricultural and construction practices. Their knowledge of astronomy, which they used to compile calendars and predict natural phenomena, formed the foundation for the development of this science. Mathematical systems based on the sexagesimal system continued to be used in Mesopotamia for many centuries. The art and architecture of the Sumerians, with their majestic ziggurats and elegant cylinder seals, continued to inspire subsequent generations. The aesthetic principles and symbolism embedded in their works were reflected in the art of Babylon and Assyria. Thus, the decline of Sumerian civilization as a political power did not mean its disappearance. Rather, it was a transformation through which the Sumerian cultural heritage was integrated into the broader Mesopotamian civilization. The Amorite invasions and subsequent assimilation catalyzed this process. Rather than disappearing, Sumerian ideas, inventions, and knowledge lived on, nourishing and enriching the cultures that succeeded them. This reminds us that civilizations rarely vanish without a trace. They often transform, passing the baton to future generations. And so, as we near the end of our journey through ancient Mesopotamia, we can confidently say that the Sumerians left us a truly priceless legacy. Their civilization, which arose in the fertile valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, became the very foundation upon which many other great cultures were subsequently built. Studying the Sumerians is not simply delving into the distant past. It is understanding the origins of what we call civilization, the very foundations that shape our modern world. The Sumerians were the first to master the art of agriculture on such a large scale, using complex irrigation systems to combat the vagaries of nature. They learned to manage water resources, transforming arid lands into fertile fields, allowing them to feed a growing population and evolve from simple communities to complex urban centers. Cities such as Uruk, and Eridu were more than just settlements, but true cradles of culture, where new ideas were born and social institutions developed. One of the most significant achievements of the Sumerians was undoubtedly the invention of writing. The transition from simple pictograms to complex cuneiform opened new horizons for them and for all of humanity. Writing allowed them to record laws, keep records, preserve knowledge, and pass it on from generation to generation. Scribes became the keepers of wisdom, and their work became the foundation for the development of education and science. The Sumerian archives, containing thousands of clay tablets, have become an invaluable source of information about the life, beliefs, and achievements of this ancient civilization. Religion played a central role in the lives of the Sumerians. Their pantheon of gods reflected both the power of nature and human aspirations. Myths of creation and the Great Flood not only explained the origins of all things, but also served as moral compass. Temples were not simply places of worship, but powerful economic and administrative centers where power and wealth were concentrated. The social structure of Sumerian society was quite complex. The city-state was the basic political unit, headed by kings, lugals, and priests. They were responsible for governance, justice, and the defense of the city. Civil rights and responsibilities were clearly defined, which contributed to the stability and development of society. The Sumerian economy was built on a solid foundation of agriculture. However, they were also skilled artisans and active traders. The development of crafts led to the emergence of specialized labor, and trade routes extending far beyond their lands facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas with other peoples. The scientific and technological achievements of the Sumerians continue to amaze us to this day. The invention of the wheel, the plow, and the development of irrigation systems, all of this radically changed farming and construction methods, making them more efficient. Their knowledge of astronomy, which they used to compile calendars and predict natural phenomena, formed the foundation for the development of this science. Mathematical systems based on the sexagesimal system continued to be used in Mesopotamia for many centuries, and even today we see echoes of this system in our division of time into hours and minutes, as well as in the measurement of angles. The art and architecture of the Sumerians, with their majestic ziggurats resembling steps to heaven and elegant cylinder seals used for identification and document protection, continued to inspire subsequent generations. The aesthetic principles and symbolism embedded in their works were reflected in the art of Babylon and Assyria, demonstrating the continuity of cultural traditions. The period of the early dynasties saw the flourishing of city-states. when they competed and formed alliances, and legendary heroes and rulers etched their names into history. The Akkadian conquest led by Sargon the Great led to the creation of the first empire, uniting the Sumerian lands under a single authority and fostering a fusion of cultures. However, Sumerian culture did not disappear. It merely transformed. The Neo-Sumerian period, particularly the reign of the third dynasty of Ur, became an era of renaissance, marked by great construction projects and cultural advancement. The decline of Sumerian civilization as an independent political force was a gradual process, associated with the invasions of Amorite tribes and subsequent assimilation. However, this did not mark the end of Sumerian influence. On the contrary, Sumerian ideas, inventions, and knowledge were integrated into the broader Mesopotamian civilization, nourishing and enriching the cultures that succeeded them. This reminds us that civilizations rarely disappear without a trace. They often transform, passing the baton to future generations, weaving their threads into the multicolored fabric of human history. The Sumerians were more than just an ancient people. They laid the foundations of what we understand today as civilization. Their contributions to history, culture, and science are enormous and undeniable. From the invention of writing to the development of astronomy and mathematics, from the founding of the first cities to the formation of legal systems, all of this laid the foundations for the subsequent development of humanity. When we look at the stars, we remember that the Sumerians were the first to systematically observe them, trying to understand their movement and meaning. When we use the wheel, we remember that it was they who gave it the shape that changed the world. When we read the laws, we see echoes of the rules they first wrote down on clay tablets. Their world, so distant from ours, nevertheless lives on within us. We find echoes of the Sumerian world in our languages, our calendars, and our understanding of the universe. They taught us not only to build cities and cultivate the land, but also to think, record, preserve, and transmit knowledge. Delving into Sumerian history is like returning to our origins, to the very roots that nourish our present. It's an opportunity to see how great cities grew from the seeds of early settlements, how complex writing emerged from simple symbols, and how the first scientific knowledge emerged from observations of nature. And even as time moves inexorably forward, leaving eras and civilizations behind, the legacy of the Sumerians remains with us. It reminds us of the boundless potential of the human mind, the power of collective work, and that even the most ancient civilizations can teach us important lessons.
As we conclude our conversation about the Sumerians, we feel not so much the sadness of parting as the calm satisfaction of learning. We have witnessed the birth of a civilization, how it developed, flourished, and through transformation passed on its precious legacy. This is the natural course of events, the smooth passage of time, where one generation replaces another, and knowledge and discoveries accumulate, forming the rich fabric we call human history. May this journey through ancient Mesopotamia leave you with a sense of peace and understanding, a realization that we are all part of a vast and continuous history, where every people, every era makes its own unique contribution.
The Sumerians are a shining example of such a civilization whose influence is still felt today, reminding us of the strength of the human spirit and the eternal quest for knowledge and development. Good night.